Hey guys, thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Chris. Today I want to talk about the Easter eggs and the after credit scene in Venom. And if you haven't watched the film Venom, please click away guys. This will be completely spoiler filled. I'll be going into detail about the movie and the after credit scene. I do have a spoiler free review that you can click on right here, or the card right above, or link in the description. That is spoiler free and I give you my thoughts on the film. But jumping right into it, let's go into some of the Easter eggs that went on in Venom. So the very first thing I'm going to touch upon is when the movie opens up, we get to see a spaceship from the Life Foundation crash land onto Earth. Now this spaceship was carrying some of the symbiotes that we'll get to see throughout the movie. However, our first Easter egg comes in the form of a reference to a SpiderMan character. Now one of the astronauts who is surviving to a point is referred to as Jameson. This is most likely a reference to J. Jonah Jameson's son, John Jameson, who in the comic books is an astronaut, was also an astronaut in the Sam Raimi universe. Spider-Man has helped him with crash landings and other situations. At one point he's even a werewolf villain. But this is just very much a reference. It's not exactly Jameson's son. And the reason I say that brings me to my next Easter egg. A little later on in the film, we see Eddie Brock and Anne having a dinner together. In this dinner, Eddie is talking about doing a story on the Life Foundation, and Anne decides to remind him that he should be careful because we do not want a repeat of the New York Daily Globe situation. Yeah, if you wanted a reminder of how far away this movie is from the MCU, there's no Daily Bugle in sight. Instead, it looks like Eddie Brock was fired and humiliated at a publication in New York City called the Daily Globe. In the comics, it's known that Eddie sometimes has shady ways of doing his business, reporting or photography. We've seen that in the Sam Raimi universe, we've seen that in the cartoons, in the comics, and it's mentioned here. But of course, the movie still decides that you don't get the basic origin of Eddie Brock and decides to do the exact same thing to him only 5 minutes later in the movie, where again, he does a shady way of practicing business, doing some gotcha journalism to the CEO of the Life Foundation, in return getting him fired from his reporting job and also losing his engagement to Anne because the information he used was through a client of hers, was classified information. So we have a double repeat of Eddie Brock's fall from grace, so that when Venom finally latches onto Eddie Brock, he has all this anger and is willing to do some crazy stuff because he has hit rock bottom. Another Easter egg in the movie is in the actual apartment of Eddie Brock. We do get to see a bench press and a couple of weights. This is just part of his character trait. He is a musclehead, loves working out, and in the comics is very well known. In his living room, he has a bench press so he gets a couple of pumps in every now and then. That was a nice little touch I found throughout the movie. And even though Spider-Man is not involved or even mentioned in any way, shape, or form throughout this film, his power set, if you know the comics, very much comes from the symbiote first being latched onto Spider-Man and then traveling to Eddie Brock. Since that does not happen in this universe, I think it's good to point out the power sets that Venom does keep, even though Spider-Man was never attached to the symbiote. In the movie, we do see that Venom does have sort of a sixth sense where he can predict danger, as he tells Eddie Brock not to answer the door, knowing that there is a villain on the other side of it. Along with that, at one point when Eddie jumps out the window, he does a sort of web swing, even though it's not really web, it's just more of his hand launching on from a distance. His ability to create weapons and shields, much like in the Capcom vs. Marvel video game and in some of the comics. He climbs up a building, much like Spider-Man would. He even mentions to Eddie Brock that once he latched onto him, he knows everything about him, even calling him a loser, knowing everything about his life. That was cool because one of the fascinating things to me is when Venom goes from Spider-Man to Eddie Brock immediately knows everything about Spider-Man, that is Peter Parker, his passwords, his enemies, his lovers, everything. That was always cool to me, so it's nice that they kept that going. But not only with his power sets, they also mention some of his weaknesses that are also references to the comic books. This live-action interpretation of Venom is again sensitive to high frequencies of sound. We've seen that in the Sam Raimi verse, in the cartoons, in the comics. The MRI machine is his deadliest weapon throughout this movie. But not only that, in that car ride where he is talking about his weaknesses, he also mentions fire, which does come later into play when you think Venom and the symbiote have been destroyed. It's also worthy to point out that Anne mentions kryptonite, which is a reference to, of course, Superman and his ultimate weakness. So I guess in this universe, DC Comics exist in comic form. And on the subject of Anne Wayne, I know I'm probably saying her name wrong. You guys can correct me down below. She does get to suit up in Venom form and looks exactly like she does in the comic books, minus, of course, the spider on her chest. And one of the final Easter eggs is just the names of the symbiotes. We have Riot, who seems to be the leader of these 4 symbiotes that travel to Earth. The other names are from the comics. We know the yellow one is Scream. She didn't really get to get fleshed out into the movie, probably saving her for the sequel. And then, of course, you have Venom, who latched onto Eddie Brock. And then the final one that does lead me to the after credit scene and explaining that is Carnage. Now, it's sort of a red herring throughout the movie that they make this symbiote blue. It looks very blue throughout the movie, so you think nothing of it. If that symbiote was red, you knew exactly who that was the entire time, but the movie didn't want to spoil that for you. By the end credit scene, we see Eddie Brock is back to being a reporter, and he landed a very nice interview. This looks like he gets to interview Cletus Cassidy, which of course, if you know from the comics, is the host of the Carnage symbiote. Now, it looks like Cletus specifically asked for Eddie Brock to be interviewing him. This leads me to believe that Cletus is actually already in possession of his symbiote, and it's most likely the blue one that disappeared after it killed one of the female scientists played by Jenny Slate. We see at that point the CEO, played by Riz Ahmed, said, "Where did the symbiote go? Where is it, guys?" And they, of course, don't have no idea because they didn't want to watch someone die. So I'm thinking that symbiote traveled from person to person, leading to Cletus Cassidy realizing how effed up his mind is and how willing he is to kill anybody. Of course, requesting the interview with Eddie Brock, knowing that Venom is inside him, and thus leading us to the sequel. That is the only reason I could think why Cletus would personally want an interview done with Eddie Brock. He's not that famous a reporter. He is seen around TV, but he has no other real motive to just be around Eddie Brock. So my theory is that the symbiote is already attached to him, and that is just the point of his breakout. And I have to say, I hate that wig they put on him. The guy looks like Carrot Top. Maybe it's because I know Woody Harrelson is bald, but really, please get rid of that. And that's really all the Easter eggs I could find throughout the movie. If there's any I missed, please let me know down below. Of course, there was the obvious Stan Lee cameo, but that's pretty obvious to anyone watching the movie, so I figured no point in mentioning that, but it was great to see him in there. If there was any I missed or other stuff you want to mention, please let me know down below. I'd be happy to discuss with you guys. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at 3C Film Review. But as always, I'm Chris. Take care.